Al Jazeera Podcasts.
I think when you're thinking about encouraging women to have children, you have to make it worth it for them. You have to make it a no-brainer and them want to have children.
Career over motherhood. It's something many women all over the world have chosen for themselves. And that's not unique. But what's been happening in South Korea is, you see, apart from a rise in 2024, South Koreans have been having fewer babies than the rest of the world. I want to know why that is. I'm Samantha Johnson, and this is Now You Know, a safe space where we go all in on stories about women. So by the end of each episode, you can say, now I know. Anna Kook is a Korean reporter with AJ+, and one of the things she covers is South Korean society and news. She's here to give us an idea about what's behind the low birth rate. So, Anna, thank you so much for joining us on Now You Know.
Thank you for having me.
Okay, before we get into it, I just want you to tell us about some of the stories you've covered in South Korea.
Well, I am Korean myself. I live and work in the US, but I do travel often back to Korea to report on various stories. Most recently, I was there covering all of the impeachment protests against President Yoon Suk-yeol and him declaring martial law. I was also there when that happened. But I also cover a lot of women's issues. I covered stories about the previous comfort women who served in prostitution for US soldiers, and US military bases are prevalent in South Korea still. So I did a deep dive on those effects. And I also covered the adoption industry in South Korea as well, and how that's affected South Korean children abroad as South Korea became the largest exporter of babies internationally. I've also grown up in South Korea, so I have a lot of Korean friends in their 20s and 30s. So I'm very familiar with, different social aspects and stories.
Which women's stories have stuck out for you?
I think for me, the rise of anti-feminism and also women in South Korea really trying to break out of this traditional gender norm that's been required for so many generations has really stuck out with me because, there's a rise of the 4B movement where a group of women are trying to reject all norms of society, not have children, not have men, not have sex, talking to men and women of such extreme viewpoints. I feel like that's such a unique thing that's happening right now in our lifetime.
What makes it so unique to South Korea?
The thing that makes South Korea unique, I feel like in this interview, you're going to be hearing a lot of extremes about South Korea, but the fact that they have the lowest birth rate, the worst gender inequality among developed nations. So I think, the fact that it's unique is rooted in a lot of these extremes that, women don't have the same equal rights in workplace culture, in society as men. And that's why these extreme movements are also coming about in South Korea.
So Anna, take us back to how the 4B movement started.
So the 4B movement and feminism movement that really started in South Korea during around 2010, 2013, that's when it really blew up. And that was also the time when famously there was this incident of a woman who was brutally murdered in the bathroom of Gangnam Station, which is a very popular, busy area in South Korea. And the culprit said that he murdered her because he hated women and he felt like men were at such a disadvantage. And, these cases are only been increasing in South Korea, which has eventually led to the 4B movement, where women are completely rejecting men and having children with men.
And when it comes to cases like that, what's been the reaction?
Right. So I think South Korea has, one of the least legal protections for women in terms of sexual and gender violence. So a lot of these men do get away with rather short sentences. And so often women are afraid to speak up. And that's why during the Me Too cases, you haven't really seen a lot of justice for these women. And So, there's this culture of women being afraid to speak up about this as well. And I think since then, the society has grown even more divided. And so you see President Yoon, he ran on a very anti-feminist campaign, and his strongest support base was coming from men in their 20s and 30s. And they really liked him for his anti-feminist policies. And he came in to also abolish the gender equality ministry. And so it's ironic to say that President Yoon, his administration declared a national demographic emergency to try to address this low birth rate and to encourage women and families to have more children. But at the same time, he is anti-feminist and doesn't want to improve conditions for women and agree with men that they are at a disadvantage. And so you can see that things haven't really gotten better.
Where is all of this coming from?
I think it's the fact that South Korean society is, rooted in a Confucius society where there are very strict gender roles traditionally. And this really is the first generation of women who are speaking up and saying, enough is enough. I don't want to adhere to these norms. I want to imagine a different lifestyle. And I think that for men have come off as we're victimized, we want things the way that they really were, and that's what's normal. And so I think this has led to a lot of discomfort and animosity among men towards women.
So would you say, or could you say, that all of these issues contributed to the incredibly low birth rates in South Korea?
I think it's a confluence of factors. It's no coincidence that South Korea has the highest inequality among developed countries and the lowest birth rate. But, this has also happened, the, downfall of birth rates in South Korea since more than a decade ago. And it's also because of the economic downturn, less employment opportunities and just a more expensive housing market. So I think it's just a reflection of how young generations in South Korea are feeling like it's really hard to have a stable life and to imagine having a stable family in South Korea. It's not that they don't want to have children. I think that when it comes down to it, they're making choices. I think there's also this idea that cultural norms have not adapted quickly enough to the changing economy. And that's where this extreme case of a low birth rate is coming from.
I mean, when we talk about low birth rates, just explain to me how the numbers work.
Mm-hmm. So South Korea in 2024 recorded 0.75 birth rate. What that means essentially is the average number of children a woman is going to have during her lifetime, during her reproductive years. And how that's calculated is, they look at women in each age group from 15 to 49 years old and see how many children women are having. And they total that and average it, which comes down to 0.75. That means that, most women are not having children. That's how you get a number less than 1. And that number had been declining, but for the first time in 2024, it had risen by 0.03, which translates to
0.03.
Yeah,
wow.
That means that that translates to about 30 more births per 1,000 women in South Korea. And I mean, also the number 30 is a very, very small number against 1,000 women. So experts are saying that this slight increase it's just way too early to be saying that this is going to be an upward trend. South Korea is trying to target for a birth rate above 1 by 2030. But in order to maintain the current population, they need it to go up to 2.1 because a woman needs to be having at least 2 children to ensure that they will be replaced. And so to imagine going from 0.75 to 2.1, there's a long way to get there.
That's a lot of pressure being put on women. But again, what's the incentive?
Exactly. I think when you're thinking about encouraging women to have children, you have to make it worth it for them. You have to make it a no-brainer. But I think that job prospects to begin with, the competition is extremely intense. And as I said, South Korea has the largest, gender disparity, especially at work. And so very few women are in leadership positions, for example. And there's also pay disparity. And so, women are working just as hard in schools and they get to employment opportunities and it's extremely limited. And to be able to advance their career is just way harder for women. And once they take maternity leave, it's also seen that you're not just working as hard as men. And so not all women are taking advantage of the maternity leave. And because they are afraid that that's going to set them back in their career.
How can the government expect to turn around a low birth rate when women aren't seen as equal?
I think it depends on the administration, obviously, but the fact that it's ironic, the fact that you're trying to turn around a low birth rate, but can't recognize that a huge proportion of that has to come from supporting women and making them feel like they can have more children and won't have to compensate for anything.
Do you know of women who are currently struggling to decide whether to have their career or go for motherhood?
I have seen women and my friends around me choose motherhood and some choose their careers. And for the women who are choosing their careers, it's an emotional decision for them because, they want to have children. I think they want to become mothers, but they look at their life and, their education, how hard they've worked to build their career up to now. And they simply just don't want to give it up. And so I think they think that maybe I can have one child later in my 30s or 40s, but that's really all I can afford to have. And until then, they all want to prioritize their careers. But I also have friends who have chosen to be mothers and unfortunately they have to stop working. And so it's really hard to see women balance both, honestly.
And tell me about Korean culture. How does it view motherhood? And how does Korean culture view women who choose their careers?
So I think that Korea views motherhood as a form of sacrifice. Most women who choose motherhood are expected to give up their jobs. South Korean women are, expected to devote all of their lives to childbearing and raising that child really well. Also because South Korea is the most expensive country to raise a child until they turn 18. And that really
Wow.
comes down to the price in education because South Korea has one of the most competitive societies when it comes to education. It's still really hard and expensive to raise a child until they become an adult, which is another huge factor into why women are choosing not to have children or have fewer kids. I think the notion that if you choose your career over having children, it's not ideal. You're definitely painted as very ambitious and that you're not willing to sacrifice, where the mother sacrificing is seen as, the ideal mother and the ideal woman in South Korea. And so it is looked down upon as you're very selfish. You're not willing to sacrifice your career to have a family, to have children.
I don't know. It just seems like, I don't know, everyone just needs to look inward. I mean, like the call is coming from inside the house. If you want change, then you have to give women equal rights. Like it's as simple as that. There is something I would like to ask. If you wanted the child, but not the man, could you do that? And if you did, what would the community say?
Right. So I think that's one of the other issues is that South Korean women, if they are single mothers, face an immense amount of stigma. And to the point that one of the worst swear words or labels in South Korea is that you are a child born out of wedlock. And so there is this large stigma against single mothers. In fact, they make up less than 5% of births in South Korea, children born
Wow.
to single parents. Whereas places like in the US, children born out of wedlock account to almost 40% of births. And so I do think that if South Korea wants to be increasing its birth rate, it also has to look at the support they're giving to single parents and single mothers, because it's really hard to have children as a single mother to the point that a lot of these kids end up being abandoned. So there is this famous service in South Korea called the baby box, where a pastor from a church came up with this idea that women, single mothers, because they face so much stigma, can anonymously abandon their child in a box, and this church or orphanage will take care of these children. And so that's become a very popular thing that single mothers also choose, because I mean, laws have changed and things have become better for single mothers now. But South Korea does have a long history until very recently of women getting expelled from schools if they got pregnant out of wedlock. And so there's a lot of societal pressure to not have a child if you are single. And so abortion rates among single mothers are also really high. And the reason that South Korea became one of the largest exporters of babies internationally, they were exporting about 200,000 babies, is because of the stigma of single mothers. So most of the children ended up being adopted overseas because that was encouraged by the South Korean government. They were encouraging adoption agencies to send these children abroad because actually they saw it as a way to deepen diplomatic ties with other Western countries. And it was a business. I mean, they were making money off of exporting children. And this was largely under, more authoritarian governments in South Korea. And this has since gotten better in South Korea. But yeah, that largely was why a lot of these children were adopted overseas. And that's why you see so many South Korean adoptees in the US and in European countries, because those were South Korea's allies post-World War II.
Do you see a future where women in South Korea don't have to choose between career and motherhood?
I would really hope so. I think in the next few years, that's looking unlikely, but I think there's a lot of efforts to try to change that. I do see people around me, younger generations, who are trying to change their attitudes towards women's employment and trying to encourage each other to take the parental leave that is granted to them without thinking that it's going to cost their career. As of right now, it is looking very grim. And again, there's a lot of support coming from elsewhere in order to make it happen, or a lot of sacrifices right now. But also, to go back to the government, I think that they don't see the connect between women's rights and birth rates. And that's also why they're investing so much into housing opportunities and housing costs and the job market. So they're kind of looking at things in more of an economic way rather than a structural and a cultural change, in order to also encourage those different factors that's contributing to the low birth rate.
Well, like you said, it's just a Band-Aid. It's all very short term. They're not thinking long term, and they're not connecting the dots.
Right. Mm-hmm. Exactly.
Wow, Anna. Look, any topic that has to do with career and motherhood, but my ears instantly pick up and I'm like, oh my gosh, I need to know what's going on in South Korea and why the birth rates are so low. And as soon as this topic came up, I'm like, yep, we got to talk about it. And you've been the perfect person to listen to.
You.
So thank you so much for giving your insight on this issue.
You.
Really appreciate it. Thank you.
Thank you.
And I hope you've enjoyed learning more about South Korea and this topic. Please share your thoughts. And if you have stories that you'd like us to explore on Now You Know, let us know in the comments. Thank you, and see you again next week.